Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of the AnthroPuzzled podcast. I'm your host, Abby Letzinger, and every 2 weeks we'll explore how anthropologists are forging unique career paths beyond the usual academic sphere. Tune in, get inspired, and start piecing together your own career puzzle within the world of anthropology. On today's episode, we have Melissa Vogel. She is a business anthropologist, corporate research leader, and CEO of Great Heron Insights, which provides research, training, and organizational consulting services to help businesses improve their workplace culture. She graduated from UPenn with a PhD in anthropology and publishes a LinkedIn video newsletter called the Anthro Minute. Her most recent roles include User Experience Research Director at Capital One and Senior Director of Qualitative Research at Hanover Research. She is also a professor emerita at Clemson University, where she founded the Business Anthropology program. How are you doing today, Melissa?
I'm good. Thank you for having me, Abby.
Yes, absolutely. So there was a lot going on in that introduction. So what is it that you do and how is it important and related in regards to anthropology?
Yeah, so at this point in my career, I am a business anthropologist and I have my own little consulting company I just started last year called Great Heron Insights. And I offer research services, training, organizational culture services for places that actually still want to have a good workplace culture, which, as you might imagine, has been a little bit challenging at this point in our country's history. So I'm still getting off the ground, but I'm very excited that I have my first client. So I've been doing projects for them. And I think it's really important because, as we'll probably get to, I also put out a weekly newsletter on LinkedIn, a video newsletter called the Anthro Minute. And I think it's really important. I think anthropologists have not done a very good job of explaining to the public what we do and why they should care. So that's the whole point of the Anthro Minute series, is to explain what anthropology is, what various anthropological concepts mean, and why it's relevant to their everyday life. So similarly, the work that I want to do as a business anthropologist is using all of my anthropological training and background and cross-cultural perspective and holistic approach to basically make life better for people, and in this case, hopefully in their workplaces.
Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of why I do this podcast, is a lot of students don't really know how to market their skills to employers. I certainly didn't know how to, and I kind of still don't know how to, but the whole point is, talking to individuals who are kind of out there doing their thing and, teaching individuals, yes, you can have a career with an anthropology degree. You just have to figure out how to apply it to the real world and explain to people what it is that you do and why it is important. Because most people, when you're like, oh, I study anthropology, they're like, oh, you studied dinosaur bones. And it's like, no, but close enough.
I got that a lot too.
So what does your day-to-day kind of look like?
Yeah, so right now, because I'm building a business, a lot of it is seeking out new projects, new clients, trying to raise my professional profile, for example, through that video newsletter on LinkedIn and through both conference presentations and publications and just general networking, because, this is my first time being an entrepreneur. And I have learned very quickly that when you're first starting a business and you're pretty much doing it alone with, at least in my case, I do have some help from my spouse, which is really great. But it means that you do spend a good chunk of your time getting business rather than executing for your clients. So I look forward to the day when it's more the executing and less of the business development piece. But you brought up something that I wanted to make sure to comment on. I think that is a huge problem that so many students are not taught. And I was guilty of this when I first started as a professor. We're not taught how to market our skills, how to translate anthropology as a background into the real world, into the private sector outside of academia. So on that note, that is one of the main reasons why I'm offering these courses through UC Riverside Extension. So back up just a little, I was a professor at Clemson University, where I started their business anthropology program back in 2016. And I probably should have explained earlier, business anthropology just takes all of the same methods, theories, perspective that we use in traditional academic anthropology and uses it to solve everyday practical business problems, right? For customers, for organizations, right? Just in general. So, I created this program so that students could learn how all of those different things they've learned apply in the business world, and then what specific types of methods they would need to know, because obviously the more traditional forms of ethnography, for example, we expect to spend these huge long periods immersed in the field, which is not usually feasible in the private sectors. So the certificate that I created and that I'm now recreating for UC Riverside, the first course is on business anthropology. So covering the main 3 subfields, which is market research, organizational culture, and design anthropology, which a lot of people have heard of that one because of UX, which is just one piece, by the way, of design anthropology. But then we also cover in the second course, qualitative methods for business. So how do you adapt a lot of the methods that we use both in anthropology and other social sciences to that business environment, to the budget, to the timelines, to the demands that you're and the limitations you're under in the business world. And then I rounded out with a little capstone focused on teamwork and leadership, because again, depending on what your subfield was in anthropology, you may or may not have learned how to work on a team or lead a team, right? Now, coming from the part of anthropology that I started in, I actually did benefit from learning all of that. So that might be a good segue to our next topic.
Yeah, so what kind of led you to choose this career path, and how did you kind of get where you are today?
Yeah, so I actually started college as a poli-sci international relations major because I wanted to see the world and just learn about other cultures, hopefully learn other languages, just get out there, you know? So I thought the best way to do that and get paid for it would be some kind of political science, international relations job. And what I found out is that most of my fellow students in that major all wanted to be lawyers, which I had zero interest in whatsoever. And also, at least in my case, I had trouble connecting with the professors. A lot of them, had very like highfalutin connections to government and policy making and stuff like that, that again, did not interest me at all. And I got lucky enough to take a couple of anthropology classes my first 2 years of school. And I found my people. I was like, wait a minute. I was like, these people are going out and seeing the world and learning about people and cultures and languages without having to be lawyers or work for the government, although some do now. But yeah, so I switched majors and I really was inspired by, I had an amazing class with a professor who was an expert in Peruvian archaeology. And just by good fortune, he brought an amazing exhibit called the Royal Tombs of Sipan to UCLA while I was studying there. And I just fell in love with Peruvian cultures and archaeology. I still was on the fence for a little while about whether I was going to do field work in Peru or in the Maya world in Central America. So I did field work both in Central America, Nicaragua and Belize, and Peru, and learned very quickly that the jungle is not my friend. There are lots of creatures there who love to eat me, and I did not enjoy that. So so I ended up working in the desert in Peru as an archaeologist. Little funny side story. When I told my dad I had switched majors and wanted to be an archaeologist, he said, "What, so you want to be poor for the rest of your life?" To which I said, "Yeah, Dad, that's exactly my goal, is to be poor for the rest of my life." But the greatest victory was after I became a professor at Clemson. He said, I should have been a professor. I was like, oh, okay, we went from you want to be poor to you wish you had my job. Got it. So yeah, so I did the traditional academic path because I didn't know a ton about the other options. However, inadvertently, and this is something I hope that your audience will benefit from, I was doing applied work the whole time just to pay the bills. And so I didn't realize that all of that applied work I did to get through grad school and when I first got out was all going to end up being relevant to what eventually became my career pivot. So, I had done project work for companies like Ethnographic Research Inc. and Smart Revenue, which frankly is exactly the type of work that I do now. And then I spent 2 years when I first graduated, because in case some of the younger folks in your audience don't know, if you are trying to do the academic path, you should be prepared to spend a few years on the job hunt, even once you have your PhD. That is completely normal. And in fact, I gave myself a deadline of 5 years because I had friends who spent 7, 8, 10 years and didn't get an academic job. And I was like, I'm not doing that. I'll give myself 5. And then if it doesn't happen, I'm figuring something else out. So the first 2 years after I graduated from UPenn, I was actually working what was technically a grad student job through UCLA's Grad School of Education, their Center for the Study of Evaluation, which again turned out to be incredible preparation for what I've been doing for the last 6 or 7 years, because I was on a team of, I was already graduated, but the other folks were grad students, and we were evaluating LAUSD's after school program. So we were working as a team to do applied research, collecting data through all the types of methods that I now teach, and pulling that all together into reports for our clients. I mean seriously, almost exactly what I do now, right? So that was a fantastic experience, and we had to deal with both qualitative and quantitative data. Ironically, even though it was a very multicultural team, I was the only one who spoke Spanish. So I did all of the parent interviews in Spanish and helped translate our surveys into Spanish. So again, all that language stuff you learn really can come in handy. You never know until later. And then my third year out of my degree, I got a slightly better paying job at a little market research firm called Phase One Communications. But again, all of this to say, I was just trying to pay the bills, right? Because I still was on the academic path. And after that third year, I got the job at Clemson, which, was great. But the one thing I want to say about that is, again, for folks who may not know, who want to go the academic route, at least when I was coming up, and unfortunately, I think it's possibly even worse now, you don't get to just say, well, I love California, I want to stay in California, because I would have preferred to stay in California. You go wherever you can get a job. And it took me 3 years to get the job at Clemson. I know people who are football fans will be horrified to hear this. I had never heard of Clemson. Had not. When I applied there, I'm like, what is this school? I don't know. But they want an archaeologist, so I'll apply. So yeah, I knew no one in South Carolina. I had no family, no friends there. I was all on my own. But I was like, okay, I got the job. I'm going to make this work, And it was a really great learning experience, because I was only the second anthropologist ever at the university. The senior colleague who helped hire me, poor guy, had been alone for 18 years running the anthropology minor in a sociology department. Yeah. And, I helped him create a major and grow the program. And we hired a biological anthropologist, and then we hired a second cultural anthropologist. And so, I really got to learn how you create and grow an academic program. And then I sort of threw them all for a loop when I pivoted from archaeology to business anthropology. And the main reason for that was, frankly, I wanted a life. I wanted a family. And I was doing international fieldwork every summer, all summer long in Peru, which on the one hand, was a dream come true. But on the other hand, I did it for almost 20 years. And I was getting old. And when I had my son, I tried bringing him to Peru for a shorter trip with my partner. And I was like, this is not going to work. There's no way, because, my partner was not an archaeologist, so she couldn't come to the field with me. There's no way in hell, after working so hard to have a kid and a family, that I was just going to spend every summer away from them, But I also had sort of gotten to do most of what I wanted to do. And, as much as it was a great experience, let me tell you, doing that kind of international work is exhausting, because you're dealing with, everything I had to do was in a foreign language. And actually, Spanish is my third language. My second language was German, which I studied for 7 years and don't use it all. But that's my heritage, so that's why I studied it. But so for me, it was a big decision, but it wasn't that hard of a decision, because I'd gotten the chance to do most of what I wanted to do in archaeology, which was great. I'd written 2 books and 18 scientific articles, and was probably at the time the leading expert on the culture I studied, which was the Cosma. I can't really claim that anymore, but that was a big pivot, but it was great. And honestly, I have to really credit my spouse for the support that she gave me during that process, because it was a lot of hard work to pivot to business anthropology. And I still miss Peru. I did get to go back just this past fall, so that was great. But that was the first time back in 10 years, because it became my second home. I have very dear friends that are still there. So that was a very long answer to sort of how I went from political science major to archaeologist and professor. I guess the last piece that I haven't filled you in on yet is, why did I leave academia? So the other part of being at a university is you have to deal with politics everywhere, right? Whether you're in business or in a university, wherever, you're not going to be able to avoid politics. And I was not at all, I don't know if I still am, politically savvy, right? I'm not very good at navigating those types of things. I'm trying to get better. I've been trying to learn for quite a while, so I hope I'm better. But, there were a lot of things going on in my department, and I had always wanted to get into administration and was working on something called an advance grant from NSF, which universities get an advance grant, frankly, because the conditions for women and people of color to advance are pretty bad. That's how you get an advance grant from NSF. So I was one of the associate directors on the advanced program at Clemson. And I was like, I'm doing the work. I'm helping change, the institution for the better. And now if I can just become a department chair or an associate dean or whatever, then I can really make some positive change. So I tried. I applied for several years to those types of roles and was getting nowhere. And the story that I like to share about this, especially for other women. So remember, I was a woman in the science side of anthropology, right? Not the humanities side, which tends to be female dominated, right? So I very much, coming through grad school, had to deal with a lot of sexism, sexual harassment. All of us did, right? And especially working in Latin America, you have to deal with the machismo there too. And so you develop like certain ways of surviving that and being able to succeed, right? So when I was told by my new dean that the reason he hadn't given me the interim department chair role that I'd applied for was because my colleagues thought I was rather outspoken, that was sort of the nail in the coffin for me in academia. Because as I told him at the time, that's kind of my personality. I don't know if I can change that for you, But it made me realize that the very skills that I had developed to be successful as a scientist, a female scientist, because of the culture of the institution I was at, I was being told that I was, too much for them. So anyways, the point of all that to say that if you do want to pursue the academic path and you do want to stay at an institution and potentially go into an administrative role, you have to learn very early on to be politically savvy, because no one at another university will give you a chance at an administrative role if you haven't had one at your current university. Because I tried that too. So if you don't have that, it's one of those, you got to have experience to get experience, right? Like if you don't have that on your CV, they're not going to interview you for somewhere else, right? So I had not known when I first started, or even frankly, when I got tenure at Clemson, how much more careful I should have been about how I presented myself to my colleagues. And maybe I should have ignored the elephant in the room when things started to get tricky. So for folks who think they might want to go that path, like it's something to be conscious of and aware of from day one, and I think most people are pretty careful till they get tenure, but then, like you're able to breathe a sigh of relief when you have tenure and you think you can relax a little, but maybe not, depending on what your goals are. So I just really felt like I'd hit a ceiling, and I'm not the kind of person that at age, I think I was about 40 then, that I was like, okay, I'm just going to give up on that and just teach these classes and run this program for the rest of my life. Because by then I had started the business anthropology program. And ironically, my friend who became chair asked me to run the grad program for her. So I did for a little while. But I just felt like I'm not going to be happy here because I'm not going to be able to advance. Right. And again, I was lucky enough to have such a supportive spouse who was like, babe, you're not happy. Just quit. And I was like, you don't understand. It's taken me 20 years to get here. Like, because people outside of academia, they don't understand. If you want to be successful in academia, you have to follow a very narrow prescribed path, and you have to hit milestones approximately when you're supposed to. There's a little wiggle room, but mostly when you're supposed to, or you're done, right? Like you're not going to continue succeeding. And I did all that. So imagine like somebody who's like been nose to the grindstone and done all that to be like, okay, I'm 40 and they're telling me I'm done because I'm too outspoken. So with her support, I started applying to jobs outside of academia. And this is another thing I like to share with people because, being in South Carolina, again, there are regional cultures in our country, right? So just as I ran into ceilings at my university, I was running into issues in the region because folks in that area, they just weren't understanding how my academic training was going to benefit them in the private sector. And, just like the students we were talking about earlier, I was still learning how to explain it to them, right? How to translate what I could bring to their business. And so that was a whole learning process. And pretty much I had to get to a point where by then I was married, I had my son, I had a few stepkids that were living with us as well. And it took until the two youngest went off to college and we were comfortable moving a little further away for me to get out of academia because I was getting interviews, but I wasn't getting jobs in the South. And so we agreed that like, well, the DC area, it's not too far from the kids, so it's doable. And now, granted, this was a far better job market than what anyone's dealing with right now. So I don't want to give, ridiculous expectations to people. But at that point, the first firm I applied to in DC hired me in 6 weeks because when you get into cities where they do hire academics for various things, they get it. You don't have to go through a laborious process to explain, right? So DC, New York, San Francisco, LA, Chicago, like bigger cities, even like the Research Triangle in North Carolina, like where they know what your academic background brings to them, it's not as hard. Now, again, today's job market is a whole nother story, which if you want, we can get into. But so we moved up to DC and that was right at the start of the pandemic, which, is a whole nother story. But that was Hanover where I became eventually as the director and then senior director of qualitative research for the whole company, which was another fantastic learning experience working with, by the way, amazingly smart people who pretty much all of them had left academia, right? Like that was the pattern of folks they were hiring there, and they considered themselves a think tank because of that. So it was a real nice place to transition out of academia into. And then from there, my partner who's worked in fintech, which if people don't know, that's financial technology. So like the tech side of banking, right? She was working at that point at Capital One and was like, this place is great. You got to come here. And so I did and had a fantastic boss who was she was the main reason I went there. She was a PhD in computer science who created a nonprofit to get Black girls into tech and still teaches adjunct, I think, at George Mason. So again, like someone who totally could see the value that I would bring to that role as a UX research director and learned a ton there. But I have to say, I also learned the difference between working for a privately held company and a publicly traded company. So that's another thing for folks to know who are thinking about moving into the private sector. I was very naive about those differences because once you get into a publicly traded company, especially nowadays, it's all about shareholders and stock prices and how business decisions will improve the stock price or improve the value for shareholders. And I really did not understand that when I started at a Fortune 100. So that was a very valuable lesson learned. To folks who've been in corporate environments, they're like, well, yeah, but I didn't know that. So anyways, hopefully others can benefit from all of these things that I learned the hard way is the point.
You made a lot of good points in regards to academia, and that's kind of the reason why I also have academics on the podcast, even though the whole point is like, jobs outside of museum work and academia, because I feel like when you're in school, academia is kind of romanticized a bit. They don't really tell you what the hardships are and what realistic expectations to look for, because most people think like, oh, I'm going to be a professor. I'm going to stay in this state, only look in this state. Whereas the reality, like you're saying, is you got to look through the entire country because options are limited. You're fighting like hundreds of other people who want to be professors to get the same one professor job at whatever university. And some individuals, like, they get into academia and it's great. And then, as you mentioned, politics hit them and they're like, I didn't realize how political academia was. And it's not like just regarding the United States politics. There's also politics within academia of like, what research projects you can work on. Is it going to like clash with something else that somebody else is working on? And, they might not like that. So I feel like having realistic expectations of what to look for when going into academia is super important for students, because I'm pretty sure that 99% of academia jobs require you to have a PhD, which costs money to go into doing. But if you're not willing to spend the time and the energy and, maybe not be able to get into it for years and years, like, is going into a PhD program really worth it if you're not sure of the outcome of an academic job? And like you said, it is way worse these days, especially because of all the things going on with the current administration and attacking higher education. It makes jobs a lot harder to find or, wanting to get into academia as well.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that folks don't realize, I naively, again, I'm exposing all of my naive assumptions, thought like, well, because I knew I at some point wanted to have a family. And I thought, well, I mean, a professor's life seems great for having a family, right? They don't have this rigid 8 to 5, Monday through Friday, have to be in the office schedule, which is true. I had a wonderfully flexible schedule. What I didn't know is, at least in my experience, and I do have friends who had much better experiences than I did. So it really does depend not only on your university, but on your department and on the culture at that time in your department. But what I found is that in many parts of academia, they don't give a crap if you have a family. That's your problem, especially as a woman, right? So, for example, now this has changed, I'm very happy to say, and in part because of the efforts of that grant that I worked on. But when I had my son, there was zero paid maternity leave at my university. None. You could take FMLA for no pay. You could use up your sick leave. That was it. So I was really fortunate that I was able to time his birth somehow for the end of spring semester. It just worked out. I always say he was meant to be, so that I could be at home with him in the summer, which is another thing people don't always know is most academics only get paid 9 months of the year. So you get paid during the school year. And unless you land a summer class, which not everybody can get a summer class because we all fight for them, right? You don't get paid if you're not teaching, or now in some disciplines, you can ask for salary as part of grants. In anthropology, that's almost unheard of. They won't give you salary in the summer. Yeah, so I timed his birth for the end of spring semester. I taught online after he was, I think, about 2 months old towards the end of the summer. And then I was right back in the classroom when he was 3 months old. So yeah, and I mean, I was fortunate that I could afford a part-time nanny so that I didn't have to right away put him into full-time daycare. But again, there was no daycare at my employer. There was no help for childcare at my, again, this is all, at least at the time, and things have changed thanks to that grant, but this was all your problem. And it was also, at least when I was there, I mean, nobody was mean to you or rude about it, but they didn't really want to hear about it either. Do you know what I mean? It was not something you could, have a conversation with your departmental colleagues and be guys, what should we do about this? It was well, you're not a serious academic if you're asking me about your baby. Right? So, and I mean, remember, I came up through archaeology at a time where I literally overheard my male professors say things like, I don't know why we train women to be archaeologists. They just go off and have babies. I literally heard that come out of one of my professors' mouths. Yeah. So and again, hopefully that's changed because I'm a lot older than probably a lot of your listeners. But that's what was going on. And when I decided to have my son, I was actually kind of terrified to tell my mentor, even though she was an amazing person. And I'm very sad to say she just passed last summer, but she'd never had kids. And she was a well-respected, highly dedicated Peruvian archaeologist. And when I told her, I was bracing myself for a little, I didn't think she'd be mean, but just a little really? You sure you want to do that? And do you know what she said to me, Abby? She said, Melissa, that's my one regret. She's like, I wish I had done what you're going to do. And so, I mean, it was music to my ears because if, Carol Mackey, who was just an incredible leading and wonderful mentor of other students, told me that she wishes she had taken the time and made that, made the carve out in her life to figure out how to have a kid and still do what she did, then I was good. I had her blessing, So, but that was not how that whole thing was treated when I was coming up, either within archaeology or in my department. And that's really something different, at least, again, just in my experience in the corporate world. In my experience, expect people to have families. They expect you to need maternity leave and paid maternity leave. My sister, who is a financial advisor, which is, incredibly demanding, also male-dominated career, got 12 weeks paid leave for all 3 of her children. So, that's something I was totally wrong about. The corporate world has changed a lot since I was a kid. And in many cases, I'm sure there's still places that are terrible, but in many cases, the corporate world is far more family-friendly than academia, which is crazy. But and that's just been an observation of mine coming through all of this, is that, when I went to Hanover and we were all dealing with COVID and everything, I never, ever had to worry about telling my boss that I had to leave early or I had to go get my son or I had to do this. She had 2 kids of her own. She's like, go do it. I know you'll get your stuff done. Go do it. She wasn't worried about it. That was a completely different attitude than what I faced in academia. It was wonderful.
Mm. And that's definitely something we need more in all professions, because you compare our maternity leave and childcare costs to other countries and you're like, you might not get paid maternity leave, and they're like, over there like, we get like 9 weeks automatically. Same with like vacation time, sick time, because you hear those stories of like, oh, this teacher got cancer and their colleagues donated their sick days because he ran out. I'm like, homeboy got cancer, what do you mean he ran out of sick day? Like, what do you expect?
Yeah.
So I think that's something that needs to be a cultural shift in the United States, is, understanding that things happen and it's okay, and it should probably like provide benefits. Like,
We are the only developed country in the world
Yeah.
that doesn't have mandatory paid maternity leave. The only one. It's crazy.
that's sad. Well, hopefully on a more positive note, are there any projects or publications that you're currently working on that you want to talk about?
Yeah. So obviously, a huge hot topic for everyone in business for the last year or two has been artificial intelligence, right? And I was really lucky that because I was working in tech for the last few years, I learned not specifically just about like building large language models or training them or any the specific AI tools, but I in general learned about building software to an extent I never thought I would have ever learned when I was an archaeologist. But when you're on the tech side of a bank, you have to learn from the software engineers what they need. And so you have to learn about their process. So I got to work on several projects that were evaluating AI tools for, the use of the bank. And it really opened my eyes to both the pros and the cons of AI, at least at this point in its evolution. So I'm really excited that I have an essay coming out in the next edition of the Journal of Business Anthropology, talking about what that was like, what it was like to work on AI research in tech and sort of the difficulties, just like we talked about politics in academia. Of course, there were politics in the bank, right? And so you definitely had folks who were gung-ho about anything and everything AI. And there was an attitude of, yes, we want this research, but we also know what we want the research to say. And that's not specific to banks, by the way. That's just happened to be where I was working. Because when you have folks that have bought into all the hype, they see it as like, well, we're doing this, so just tell us how great it is, right? And that was really tricky to navigate because, yeah, some tools did some cool things, but most of them did not live up to the promises they made. And then you're trying to tell people in positions of power who are spending tens of millions of dollars on these tools, well, it's okay. We're not sure that it really improves efficiency or productivity, but, it did save a little time over here. So, it was really eye-opening for folks who want to hear a little insider's view. Journal of Business Anthropology, I think that issue is probably coming out pretty soon in the next couple months. And then I've also been working with a friend of mine's market research firm, and we did our own self-funded research to compare AI moderated interviews with human moderated interviews. And we're writing that up right now for human organization, the Journal of the Society for Applied Anthropology. So in fact, I think our deadline is coming up right at the end of this month. So we got to hurry up and finish the article. And that's going to be really cool to sort of lay out for people the specifics of what we observed. I'm not going to give any spoilers, but there are obviously significant differences, at least at this point, in the evolution of AI moderators in terms of, your output and your quality and all of that. So look for that article. And just in general, I really want to help anthropologists use AI wisely because we need to know how to use it. If we don't learn how to use it, we're just going to be dinosaurs and we're all going to be out of a job, right? But we also need to know how to approach it with all of those great critical thinking skills that we developed in school during our training. And again, the thing that I'm still trying to get good at, be politically savvy about how to apply that in different situations. So, there are times when I'm in certain environments where I might keep my thoughts to myself at that moment about whether a tool is worth using or not, until I feel like I'm in a safe place where I can say, yeah, that thing is crap. Whereas, oh, we had some success with this tool. So yeah, I really hope that anthropologists educate themselves. I did a workshop at AAA's in November specifically on the fundamentals of AI to give folks some of that foundation so that they can themselves go out and try different tools and evaluate them and have a better feel for where is all of this coming from? What do I need to look out for? How do I know if I can trust this or not?
Okay. Yeah, AI is definitely a big topic these days, and, the pros and cons, especially with environmental consequences for using AI and the use of it as a fix all and not a tool to help things. Kind of like, oh, if I'm writing a paper, I just need help with coming up with some concepts and then write the paper rather than I want it to write the whole paper. Not a great use of the tool. So I think there needs to be a little bit more education of how to use AI appropriately. But with the tools that you have obtained by studying anthropology, being an anthropologist, do you feel that it has kind of broadened how you view the world?
Oh, absolutely. And that's exactly the kind of thing I share in the Anthro Minute, because I really believe that the world would be a better place if we all had a little anthropological training. Because, first of all, we're all humans, which is the object of study in anthropology. And we're all very deeply embedded and affected by, our culture and whatever other subcultures we may belong to over the course of our life. And unfortunately, as we said earlier, we as anthropologists have not done a good job of explaining to people why that matters. And, the world is not going to get any more distant. The world is only going to keep getting smaller, right? No matter what's going on right now in foreign policy, that's not going to change. We live in an interdependent global economy. And if anything, we're likely to just become more and more enmeshed with each other. So the more that we can approach learning about other people, whether they're next door or around the world, from a perspective of openness, of cultural relativism, trying to holistically understand the cultural logic behind behaviors that might at first seem odd or mysterious to us. I just think it makes for a better future for humanity. And that's what worries me about some of the stuff that's been happening in the last couple of years is, making people afraid of the other and trying to scapegoat people who are not like you only leads us down a really dark and terrible path as a species. So I really feel like it sounds probably a little overblown, but I really feel like anthropology could make a huge difference in all of us living in a better connected, happier world. And, that's one of the reasons why I want to do more of the organizational culture work in these companies to make them better places for people to work and for people to understand their own customers better. Because, it's really foolish. If you're running a business, it's really foolish to think that you don't need to care about who your customers are and what they need and what they want and where they come from. Because you're going to be far more successful at selling your products or services when you take an interest in your customers.
Yeah, and I think a lot of value that we bring as anthropologists is understanding that being different is good. It's also beneficial because if you have the same person throughout the entire world, that's really boring. Like,
Yeah.
you don't learn anything new. And I think that, our differences should be celebrated and not used as points of contention. But it takes a lot of looking within. And also, I think one big thing is if someone has the capability of doing it, travel to another country.
Yes.
If you stay in your hometown your entire life, you're never going to learn anything different. Like, oh, that's just how people are. And it's like, if you even go just 30 miles away, that might not be the case.
I agree. And I would add one little tidbit to that, which is if for some reason you can't right now get to another country, put yourself in an uncomfortable situation. Put yourself in a situation where you're the only person of your race or gender or sexuality or whatever other demographic category you want in the room, because that feeling of discomfort helps you feel how other folks might feel and hopefully generate some empathy and some compassion for what it feels like to be that other person. And, again, it doesn't matter what color you are, what gender, what sexuality, understanding someone else's perspective and how they might feel, I think it's going to make you a better person.
Overall. Now, for the individuals who are looking to go get a degree in anthropology and might be looking into higher education, do you have any advice for prospective students?
Yes, and sadly, it has changed significantly because of all the things that have happened in the last few years. I used to tell, especially when I was still a professor, you won't find this surprising. I used to tell people, like, look, if you want to go into academia, first of all, like you said earlier, you have to have a PhD to be successful. The only paths where you cannot have a PhD would be art, or in business, you can usually have like an MBA. But otherwise, if you want to be successful as an academic, you're going to have to put in the time and the money to get a PhD. That is completely not true if you're not sure you want to be an academic. And in fact, unfortunately, with a lot of the negative attitudes towards higher education in the last few years, I have found that my PhD can be a liability. I have had career coaches tell me to hide my degree at the bottom of my resume. So I really think it's important for students to take the time before you just like sign up for a grad program because like, well, I finished undergrad, so I should go to grad school now, right? And I know a lot of folks, that can be something to do to wait out this terrible job market. So it's not necessarily a bad idea, right? But when you're deciding what program you want, really give thought about which path you want to take. Because like we said earlier, if you do want that academic path, you need to find out what all the milestones are and you better meet them or you're probably not going to make it, right? And even if you meet them all, you might not, because as we just said, the academic job market unfortunately just continues to get worse, especially now with AI. If you're like, well, I don't know if I want to be a professor. In fact, maybe I'm pretty sure I don't want to be a professor. The only reason to do a PhD is if it's something you deeply want in your heart, because let me tell you, it's going to test you and you better want it bad. Because my first year at UPenn, there were times when I was like, wait, why am I doing this? Why am I putting myself through this? And I was fortunate that I had enough fellowship money that I didn't go deep into debt to get through grad school. Some people take out incredible amounts of loans and I was not willing to do that, because I was paying for my own education. I'm like, no way, I'm not going that deep into debt. So, really think about what path you think you want to take, because I know plenty of people who are very successful with a master's in applied anthropology. You don't need a PhD. And like I said, unfortunately, with some of the attitudes right now, it can hold you back. I would never have said that 5 years ago, because 5 years ago, a master's was good, but a PhD was better. So even in the business world, you could leverage that advanced degree towards a promotion. Right. And my own spouse saw her job opportunities improve when she did go back and get a master's in business. Right. So like, it's still true that I think, in certain fields, having that advanced degree can help you get an edge for promotion or something like that. But yeah, really. And also the personal piece, like your personal goals, what you want for your personal life matters. So really keep in mind and investigate. Like, I had friends in grad school who already had a partner when they came. They had a very different experience in grad school, because grad school is not oriented towards people who have spouses and partners and children and all of that. So, if that's important to you, keep in mind what that's going to mean for your path in school, right? And just like we talked about earlier in terms of like where you can live, I had a very good friend who was a brilliant archaeologist, but she happened to have been married when she went through her PhD program, and her husband had a really great job when she graduated. They could not move. He could not leave the area. She still lives in that area. So she had to she did manage to work at a university, but not as a professor. Like, she ended up going into the staff side of higher education, which I think she really enjoyed, which was great, but it's going to limit your options, right? If you geographically need to stay in an area for family reasons, that's going to matter. So I really hate that a lot of times and I did this in all of my professional development classes, I had folks do a personal strategic plan that not only talked about their professional goals, but their personal goals. Because too often, I think faculty and even sometimes career centers shy away from the personal side. They're like, that's your business. We don't want to. But people should be encouraged to give some thought to that when they're 22 years old, 24 years old, because if you think, well, sure, yeah, someday I'm going to want kids, you're going to need to factor that into your decisions.
Yeah, and it makes it even harder if you and your spouse are both academics, but in different disciplines.
Oh,
Because you might not be able to get into the same university. I had a guest on who was like, that was a big point of contention was me and my spouse were professors in different fields, and it made it really hard to find one university that would take both of us.
Yeah. I mean, people who are able to do that, it's amazing. That's like a miracle when that happens.
Yeah. So before we get into our final 4 questions, has there been anything that we haven't discussed today that you'd still like to talk about?
So this is a little bit out there, but I am a big believer that if you want to achieve something, you need to speak it out loud and try and, bring it into being. I get a little woo-woo about the manifesting things. And just like what we've been talking about with helping people understand the importance and relevance of anthropology, I think we need a public figure that's out there. And we haven't had one since Margaret Mead died, right? And a lot of people today don't even know who the hell Margaret Mead was because it's been so long, right? So I would love to eventually be and the closest thing I can think of to what Margaret Mead used to do for anthropology is what Brene Brown has done for psychology. And by the way, I didn't know until I looked it up. Her PhD is actually not in psychology, it's in social work. But look what she has done for so many psychological concepts and theories and people's understanding of why it's important or relevant for them. Like she has really put out into the public, if we want to know about something that's sort of psychologically related, we call Brene Brown, get her to talk, So I would love to somehow end up being the Brene Brown of anthropology. And if not me, then please someone, because we need a public figure that can explain, psychologists have done some really great things for the world, but in general, they don't tend to focus on the importance of culture and the cultural similarities and differences that both unite us and make us special, right? And we need that. We need somebody who's out there explaining to people what you said earlier, like that all of these differences are equally valid and matter and are beautiful and interesting, and it makes the world a more interesting place. We don't want to all be the same.
And I feel like you said, anthropology has kind of been lacking in that regards of putting anthropology on the map, because my parents said the same thing when I was getting an anthropology degree. They're like, so you want to be poor? And I'm like, do I look like someone who wants to be poor? Like, that's not why I'm going to school. Like, and so it was really hard to try to explain to them, like, this is why I want to get into anthropology. I love different cultures. I love traveling. Even though I'm an introvert and sometimes I'm like, ew, people, I also like observing people. It's like, what other career can you have other than being an anthropologist that immerses you so deeply into humankind? And I think, a lot of people who go into anthropology, I don't want to say they're like, oh, I don't care so much about the money. I feel like, everybody wants to make money. I'm sure everybody wants to be rich at some point. But we go into it more of, what can I get out of this? What's the experience I can get? What are what can I learn from this? And if I make money along the way, great. If I can make a lot of money along the way, even better. But it's not like our top concern when we do that.
But I'm glad you brought that up, because I want folks who maybe are thinking about the academic path or already on it to know that it's quite all right to want to make a decent living, and academia still pays crap. Like, it's a shame that in this country we have so devalued education that both K through 12 teachers and university professors do not make enough. And again, with AI, I think it's going to get worse, because AI has sold itself as being able to do a lot of the things that educators do. And I think you mentioned earlier, that doesn't mean it's doing it correctly or accurately. And we need people that have the subject matter expertise to discern that and to be able to evaluate outcomes and say, actually, that's wrong. That's totally wrong. Or they got this part right, but this part's not right, So yeah, I mean, it's okay to want to make money. And by the way, like, a lot of people don't understand that part of the problem is that the state and federal governments have so defunded their support of universities that even though students and their parents complain about how expensive it is to go to college, it's because universities, at least public universities, used to receive far more of their financial support from the government. And over decades, it has been stripped away. So that was one really, really valuable lesson I learned as part of a leadership program at Clemson. We got a great presentation from the chief financial officer who explained where the university gets its income. And I was shocked how little of it came from the state when it was a state, it was the land grant University of South Carolina, right? Overwhelmingly, they get their money from alumni donations.
Wow.
That's where it comes from. Or if you can get a big corporate donation, even better, right? Like, and I learned that a little bit at UCLA because, they figured out early on that like to be a leading public university, you need corporate partnerships. So like, it's really a shame the way the model has gone in the United States. And I don't see that changing much anytime soon. So I really encourage people to consider not going the academic route unless they really, really want to do it.
Yeah, and that's what a lot of people don't realize is, when they start defunding things like education, if your population is not educated, it makes it a lot easier to control.
Yes.
People are not putting those puzzles together, but it's difficult. Like when individuals will be like, oh, when you went to college, your values or your viewpoints changed. And it's like, I got more information. That is why things have changed and I see things differently and yada, yada, yada. But it's become a point in this country where people feel that like, oh, you have an education, you must think you're better than me or you know more than me. Or people are like, oh, like science. When COVID-19 happened, a lot of like the confidence in our scientists went so far down. And it's just because, things kept changing. They're like, oh, you need to be 6 feet apart. Oh, you need to wear a mask. Oh, you don't need to wear a mask. And that's not because they were just changing their minds. It was new information coming in. And I don't think people realize that's what happens when you do science. You're testing a hypothesis. You're going to get information. You're like, oh, need to change hypothesis because I got all this new input in. And it's just so sad.
I agree with everything you're saying.
What can we
It's 100% true. Yeah, it's true. But you're absolutely right. When people want to gain and maintain power, controlling information is a key part of that, And we've also seen, unfortunately, how powerful it is when you just repeat a lie enough times, people start to believe the lie. And that's why I think, again, not just anthropology, but education in general needs to make sure that people understand the value of learning how to think for yourself, how to think critically, how to do the research yourself, and not just ask Claude or Gemini or whoever, whichever model, which has only been trained on, very biased data. And by the way, stolen IP, like, I've had at least half a dozen of my articles stolen for training of AI models. You can actually look it up on a database. Like, yeah, so we need to educate the public on a lot, not just anthropology.
Yeah, exactly. Now, for final 4 questions, the first one I have for you is, what is the best piece of advice you would offer to someone who is interested in getting into your field?
So we actually touched on this earlier, which is as early as you possibly can, start learning how to translate how your anthropological training and skills apply outside of the university, right? Outside of academia. And it absolutely does. So just to give you a quick example, I wrote an article recently for the Anthropology Career Readiness Network called From Trowels to Tech, and talked about how the skills that we gain as archaeologists are incredibly useful in the business world, because unlike some areas of anthropology, we never work alone. Never. We're always in teams, and sometimes very large teams. My last big project in Peru, I had 30 people from 3 different countries and a variety of disciplinary specialties and at different stages in their career path, all working on a big team, And so like those are skills that clearly translate to the business world. You're also, in most cases, not just archaeology, you're learning how to manage a budget and deadlines. And those are things you're going to have to do in the business world. We talked about the political savviness that you need regardless of which direction you go. And things like understanding how to study human behavior. That's incredibly valuable in, whether it's market research, UX research, any kind of customer research or organizational culture work. Like, it boggles my mind that we don't have more anthropologists working in HR, for example. Like, we should have a lot more anthropologists in human resources. And I know it's become topic non grata. Is that the right reference there? Instead of persona non grata. But DEI professionals should have a huge number of them should be anthropologists, because trying to make a diverse, equitable, and inclusive workplace is absolutely right up anthropologist's alley, right? Like that is absolutely something that we should be doing, which is, by the way, one of the things that I do as well. So learn very early on it's literally like what we do as anthropologists, right? We adapt to different cultures. We learn different languages. Do the same thing for explaining what you do to folks. I'm literally practice your elevator pitch, right? And I did an article with Adam Gamwell for Anthropology News about this. Like learn how to share what your value proposition is with potential employers or just people you're networking with, right? To explain how your background is useful because it is, right? And learn the terminology they use. So depending on what field you want to go into, like I personally have not worked in healthcare, but I bet I would have to learn a totally different focal vocabulary because when I went into tech, I had to learn a whole new language, right? There's a whole bunch of things they say, even when you're not an engineer, there's a whole bunch of terminology they use commonly that I had to learn. And my notebooks, because I'm an old school, write things down on pen and paper, my notebooks from my first few months in that job are just full of terms and phrases and concepts that I was like, what do they mean by this? And I would like circle back and find out. That's one that I learned is circle back, right? That's a term they use. Double click on stuff, which I hate that, but they use it all the time. So learn the lingo, because if you can learn the lingo and be able to give your elevator pitch to people about how your anthropology training applies to the business world, they'll get it.
Pretty much. So I had applied for a job and it was for the same position, but two different departments. So I did the first interview, thought I did great, even though I don't feel as I'm like a good interviewee person. Didn't get the job. And I'm like, dang, that sucks. And then they post another job and I'm just like, is this the same job that I didn't get the first time? I'm like, I'll just apply again. Totally different department. It was the same individuals interviewing me, except the manager changed because it was a different department. And I was just like, okay, I think they're going to ask the same questions. So what can I do to better prepare myself for this second go around to hopefully get the job? And I thought to myself, I'm like, I don't know many people who are in the legal context who have anthropology degrees, who know what they do and how it is beneficial. And so one of their final questions to me is like, oh, is there anything else that you want us to know about you? And I'm just like, heck yeah, I I have an anthropology degree and this is what that means. And I'm not saying that got me the job, but I think it did. It kind of piqued their interest of like, oh, that's interesting. How can this be beneficial to us? So I kind of contributed a little bit to that. But I definitely agree. Like having to market yourself to your employers is super important. And it's a skill that you have to develop. It's not something you just automatically get. But anyways, so you kind of already answered this question a little bit, but are there any changes that you wish to see in your industry?
Yeah, so we're going through a really rough time now in research. And that's whether that's market research, UX research, from what I understand, even government roles that are research related. Obviously, if you worked in the federal workforce with all the recent layoffs, frankly, the only area that might still be doing okay, and even then they're dodging all sorts of problems with grants and things, is healthcare research. But because of, the anti-intellectual, anti-higher ed, anti just general like educational attitudes that are out there right now. And then again, with AI trying to claim that it can do all the things that highly educated researchers can do and do it for supposedly less money, which by the way, that's a whole other thing about what AI really costs, right? Because it's incredibly expensive, actually. There has been a massive devaluation of research across the corporate world. And I really believe that's going to start having an impact soon. And it's going to hit those companies' bottom lines pretty hard, because if you don't do the research and you just pump out products that so-and-so executive is their pet project and they're like, of course, this is a fabulous idea, we should do this, blah, blah, blah. And you don't do the research to find out, first of all, do people even want this? Does it work for them? Right? Is there something else they need it to do? Right? All of the questions that researchers ask for companies, they're just going to start pumping out stuff and customers are going to get ticked off. And they're going to go to your competitor who's still paying for research, right? Because at some point it will impact the product. Like at first you might not, it might be little things, but eventually if you're really not bothering to put the time and money into doing the research, it's going to start falling apart. And unfortunately, in certain areas, that can be catastrophic, right? I mean, when you're talking about, for example, like handling people's money, you can have some pretty bad failures if you're not doing a good job. And researchers are often in the role of, like I said earlier, this very difficult role of having to speak truth to powerful people and having to tell them, in some cases, bad news, right? Like, guys, this really doesn't work the way we thought it would. We need to fix it, right? So I really would love for that transition to happen very soon, for folks to realize like, oh, we need to start investing again in research because we've let things fall apart. And then the other piece, which I'm sure will take longer, is, we were on such a great path for a while there of people starting to, at least I thought, starting to understand what the benefits of having a diverse workforce are. I mean, literally, there are plenty of business cases laying out the financial benefits to companies of having a diverse workforce and recognizing diverse viewpoints. And, again, with just political and ideological shifts, that has been almost wiped out in many places. And again, I think that's going to start hitting people's bottom line. I mean, look what happened to Target. Like, Target is nosediving because of the, stuff they abandoned that they had been championing before. And they're not the only ones, right? So I hope that, we're going to see a little improvement this year. I'm sure it's going to take longer for both of my wishes to come true, especially the DEI one, because, now that that's out of favor, folks who were already in power who didn't want to give it up are like, yay, we don't have to worry about giving up power anymore. So that is going to take a little longer, but I think the value of research, I really hope before the end of this year, people are going to start saying, oh crap, because they've let go hundreds of thousands of researchers. Like, researchers are getting laid off, and well, they have been for even before last year, but it really peaked last year. So hopefully that changes, because if not, I really think it's going to be an interesting battle to see which companies win. And I think it's going to be the ones who continued investing in research.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, on a more positive note, what do you just absolutely love about the work that you've done in the industry that you've worked in?
I mean, I think sharing with the public about the value of anthropology and helping really change the way they see the world is the most gratifying thing. Whether they were my students or folks that I worked with in various companies or clients that I did research for, helping them understand that having that human-centered and that culture-centered approach not only makes a difference for, whether it's their business or their education, but just their outlook on life. I mean, it really is a powerful discipline for changing how people see the world. And that's really inspiring to me. So whether it's, a course they took with me or a project I did for them, or they just watch my Anthro Minutes, like, that's something I absolutely love, and, hope that I can keep doing that pretty much until I die.
So where can listeners learn more about you and what you do then?
Yeah. So I already mentioned, I have this newsletter on LinkedIn, the Anthro Minutes. You can find me under my name, Melissa Vogel, on LinkedIn, and sign up for the newsletters. You also can just go to the American Anthropological Association's YouTube site. They did this in partnership with me. I teamed up with them when I had the idea. So they have an archive of all 50 of last year's Anthro Minutes there. You can sign up to take one of my classes with me at UC Riverside Extension. So I know this may air a little bit later, but those classes start in March, but should be continuing as long as we have good enrollment. So check that out. If you are at all interested in working in culture and belonging, which is what a lot of us are referring to now that DEI has become a forbidden term. I co-founded with some of my fellow DEI practitioners the Culture and Belonging Strategies Network. And you can check out, either my recent articles that are more business anthropology focused, or if you were intrigued by what the heck was Melissa doing in Peru all those years, you can check out my very academic books on Amazon.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking some time out of your day and talking about all things anthropology. I think all the advice and the viewpoints that you gave will be beneficial to students, because I think as a society, we like to sugarcoat things. And I think there needs to be a little bit more honesty out there so that students can make the best decisions for themselves instead of going on a path that has been romanticized for centuries. So again, thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. And not only romanticized, but the path has changed. So, I think unfortunately some of the more senior folks may or may not realize how much it's changed for the younger generation. So, yeah, they need to realize that the path they took, that's not what's out there for the younger folks right now, unfortunately.
Exactly.
So, but there are other options is the great news. So, thank you so much for having me, Abby.
Yeah, of course. Well, I hope you have a fantastic rest of your night, and I look forward to maybe chatting again in the future.
For sure. All right. Keep in touch. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks for listening to another episode of AnthroPuzzled. This show was produced by me and distributed in collaboration with the American Anthropological Association. A special thanks to Cheyenne Brewer for editing the website, L. Akers for the incredible logo design, and to AnthroPuzzled's intern for the episode descriptions. The music is courtesy of Chad Crouch, aka Poddington Bear of Sound and Picture. If you have any questions, you can reach me at abby.letzinger@anthropuzzled.com or as AnthroPuzzled on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. Until next time.